Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, my name is Robert Sellers. I'm the Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer here at the University of Michigan. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2021 Nancy Cantor Distinguished Lectureship on Intellectual Diversity. The Nancy Cantor Distinguished Lectureship on Intellectual Diversity was created in 2002 to honor the former U of M provost for her unwavering commitment to expanding social justice and access to a high-quality education to communities that have traditionally not had such access. Nancy has continued her promotion of social justice and educational access beyond the University of Michigan during her tenures as Chancellor and President at the University of Illinois at Champaign, Syracuse University, and currently as Chancellor of Rutgers University, Newark. In many ways, the lecture series not only honors Nancy, but has come to symbolize the University of Michigan's continuing commitment to become a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive community. Previous keynote speakers for the Cantor Lecture have included Nancy Cantor herself, John Payton, Richard Atkinson, Claude Steele, Pat Gurin, Thomas Leviste, and Frank Wu. We're delighted today to welcome the 2021 Nancy Cantor Distinguished Lecturer on Intellectual Diversity, Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. And Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum will participate in a conversation on race and racism with our own Dr. Tabby Chavis. Now, we have, over the last 2 years, experienced an epidemic with regards to COVID that has completely and totally changed our lives, both as individuals as well as a larger community. And there can be no doubt that COVID has changed not only the way that we've acted today and will continue to act today, but will have widespread implications for who we are as a community in higher education. At the same time, we as a society have also undergone another type of epidemic, and that's an epidemic dealing with issues of structural racism and inequality. And there is no doubt that this also is a turning point in our society as well. How are we on the other end of this conversation as a country? What are we going to look like? How are we going to act? How are we going to change? These are all important questions that we must face and we must confront in the coming days, months, and years. Today's conversation will be part of our university's efforts to come to grips with how we can become an anti-racist institution. And in our conversation today, we're going to address a number of hard topics. Topics such as, why is it so hard to have these conversations? We're going to talk about how can we interact and discuss across our differences in ways that are productive, meaningful, but also respectful and lead to important changes in who we are, both as individuals and as a larger society. We're going to deal with issues related to current controversies regarding critical race theory, as well as how do we harness the energy that has come from in the wake of murders of such individuals as Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and unfortunately so many more. How do we harness this moment to make a change in who we are as individuals and as an institution? And to have this conversation, I can think of no better person to lead us in today's Nancy Cantor Distinguished Lecture than Dr. Beverly Tatum. Dr. Beverly Tatum is President Emerita of Spelman College and is also one of the most important thought leaders on the role that race plays in higher education, both at the K through 12 level as well as higher education in general. Her 13 years as the president of Spelman College from 2002 to 2015 were marked by innovation and growth. Her visionary leadership at Spelman was recognized in 2013 with the Carnegie Academic Leadership Award. I can also tell you that she is beloved by her former students and continues to be a mentor and serve as a role model for them to this day. A U of M trained clinical psychologist, Dr. Tatum is widely known for her scholarship on race relations in schools. She's an award-winning author of several books, including the best-selling Why Are the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? Now in a new 2017 20th anniversary edition. Also, Can We Talk About Race and Other Conversations in an Era of School Resegregation, as well as her book, Assimilation Blues, Black Families and White Communities, Who Succeeds and Why. Dr. Tatum has received numerous awards over her career. In fact, far too many of them for me to mention all of them here. However, we are going to mention just a couple to give you some sense of how fortunate we are to have her as our guest today. In 2005, Dr. Tatum was awarded the prestigious Brock International Prize in Education for her innovative leadership in the field. She's a fellow of the American Psychological Association and received the 2014 recipient of the APA Award for Outstanding Lifetime Contributions to Psychology, one of the highest awards that the American Psychological Association gives. She is an active civic leader in the Atlanta community. She's engaged in several educational initiatives designed to expand educational opportunities for underserved students and their families. In Atlanta, she serves on the governing board of the West Side Future Fund, Achieve Atlanta, Morehouse College, and the Toll Charitable Foundation. She is also on the boards of Smith College, TIA Charitable, and the Educational Testing Service. With regards to her educational background, Dr. Tatum holds a BA degree in psychology from Wesleyan University and an MA and PhD in clinical psychology, as I mentioned earlier, from the University of Michigan, as well as a MA in religious studies from Hartford Seminary. Over the course of her career, she served as a faculty member at the University of California, Santa Barbara, Westfield State University, and Mount Holyoke College. And prior to her 2002 appointment as president of Spelman, she served as the dean and acting president at Mount Holyoke College. On a personal level, Dr. Tatum is married to Dr. Travis Tatum. They are the parents of 2 adult sons, including Dr. Aja Sofé, who received his PhD in social psychology at the University of Michigan. So Dr. Tatum is a Wolverine through and through, and on a personal level, from my perspective, she's been an outstanding leader, someone who I've looked up to through both my scholarship as well as an educational leader throughout my career. And Dr. Tatum brings to our conversation today great wisdom derived both from her career as a highly regarded leader in higher education, as well as her groundbreaking scholarship in race and education, strategies for creating inclusive campus environments, as well as higher ed leadership. Our conversation partner for today's event is Dr. Tabby Chavis. Dr. Chavis is the director of the National Center for Institutional Diversity, or NCID. She's also currently the Associate Dean for Diversity in the College of Literature, Sciences, and the Arts, as well as Professor of Education and Professor of Psychology here at the University of Michigan. She is in her own right a national thought leader in the area of race and education. She's published extensively on issues of racial identity development, racial discrimination, as well as risk and resilience factors associated with African-American student success and development. In her role as director of NCID, she has spearheaded the university's efforts to be relevant leaders in the national conversation about the role of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in education. Dr. Chavis has also served in numerous leadership roles here at the University of Michigan, including most recently as the Associate Vice Provost for Research. I can think of no better person to lead us in our conversation today with Dr. Beverly Tatum than Dr. Tabby Chavis. So it is my pleasure to turn things over to her now. So I would like to introduce both Dr. Beverly Tatum and Dr. Tabby Chavis.
My host needs to unlock my video, sorry.
Go ahead, Tabby, you should be able to go.
No, it says the host has stopped it. Sorry.
Sorry about this. I have it allow panelists to start videos, so go ahead and try again.
I will. Let's see. It's not letting me. Apologies.
Let me see what I can do. Hold on one second.
Here we go. Yay!
Hey.
After a year and a half of Zoom, there is, you think you've learned all things, and there's always something new. So hopefully people will embrace that as part of the current culture and societal changes. Speaking of which, the topic of race and racism, certainly is not a new topic, but part of what I'm truly excited about is talking with Dr. Tatum about this topic, especially in the current context of the past year and a half of the what is called the parallel pandemics of COVID and the kind of resurgence of awareness and action around systemic racism. I'm so excited and honored to have this conversation today with Dr. Beverly Tatum. I want to start by noting that this is the second time I've been able to have a conversation with Beverly in front of a large public audience. The first time was 5 long years ago in 2016, when U of M hosted the Difficult Dialogues National Resource Center Conference, which of course was held in person in one of our large ballroom style auditoriums. I don't think 5 years ago, any of us could have predicted all that would have happened in our world. I think some of what has happened has been surprising, but some hasn't, especially given what we know about the history of race and racism in the United States. For example, as noted, COVID-19 has illuminated and magnified a slew of systemic racial inequalities that also intersect with socioeconomic and gender inequalities. The renewed attention to police killings and ongoing police violence against Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities, as well as the prevalence and uptick of anti-Asian violence, are tragedies and challenges that continue to be on our minds. So with that in mind, I'd like to start our conversation with a broad set of questions, Beverly, for you. What's at the top of your mind right now? That is, what are the questions and conversations that you have no doubt been encountering and engaging over these past 18 months as people are trying to understand, think about, become newly aware, and what are you hearing from that people want to talk about, and what are they grappling with?
Yes. Well, first, let me just say I'm delighted to be in conversation with you, Tabby, again. 5 years later, a lot has happened. And I also want to thank Rob Sellers, Dr. Rob Sellers, for such a warm and gracious introduction. I am a very proud Michigan graduate, and I'm sorry I can't be actually in Ann Arbor for this conversation, but I so appreciate this opportunity. And Nancy Cantor is certainly someone whose work I have long admired, so it's a real honor to be here as part of the Nancy Cantor lecture series. I have been thinking about this question because this parallel pandemic, as it's been referred to, of the racial reckoning that occurred following the death of George Floyd, has really been a catalyst for a lot of conversations. A lot of people have reached out to me and said, will you speak to our group? Will you talk about X? Will you do a podcast? Will you, a lot of desire for conversation. But when I look back on those conversations, what I can tell you is they're the same questions I heard 20 years ago. They're the same questions, but with perhaps a new sense of urgency. What strikes me as different today in 2021 is that more people are asking the questions, but the questions are very similar. So one question that has been part of my professional life for 40 years is, why is it so hard to talk about these issues? Why is it so hard to talk about racism? And since the George Floyd, I use that as a sort of marker, a time marker, since the death of George Floyd, I have had more people asking me this question, but it is the same question. How do I talk about this with my children? It's so hard. I don't know what to say. How do I talk about this in my workplace? If I'm the leader of the workplace, what conversation should I be facilitating? If I'm in higher education, how do we get our students to really think and talk about these conversations with civility at a time when there's so much polarization? The level of polarization, I think, is new, but the challenge around having these conversations remains the same. And I thought it might be helpful for this audience to just take a moment to talk about why it is so hard, because that is such a perennial question. And what I find is that one of the reasons it's hard has to do with each, when I think about racism and its persistence, I think about history, I think about public policy, I think about psychology. And in some ways, I want to start with the psychology of it, because if you think about the psychology of it, we all, as human beings, have personal histories. And that personal history is rooted, if you grew up in the United States, and I know not everyone did, but if you grew up in the US, that personal history is rooted in a racial context that, even if it wasn't talked about, was shaping our view of the world. What do I mean by that? If you think about your own, and by you, I mean, not just you, Tabby, but everyone listening, if you listening, think about your own growing up experience. And if we were all in the same room and I asked you to think about your earliest race-related experience, my guess is, after a minute or two, I might say, raise your hand if you've thought of something. And almost everyone's hand would be up. Now, I would assure you that you don't have to tell me what you thought of. You can keep that story to yourself. But I might then ask, well, okay, you've remembered something. Many of us, including me, we've all remembered something. How old were you at the time that you remembered that incident, whatever it happened to be? If we were all in the same room, I might ask people to show their hands, raise your hand. People hold up fingers. People would hold up 5, 6, 7. I would see a lot of 5s and 6s and 7s. Some people might have both hands up, 10. Some people too old to count, right? 15, 20, depending on their background. But I share that to say a lot of us have early experiences. A lot of us have experiences that go back to maybe early school days, maybe kindergarten, first grade. And then if you were to ask, as I often do, what emotion is attached to your experience? Many people will say things like confusion, anxiety, fear, embarrassment, shame, sadness, isolation, Sometimes people say love or friendship or something that is more happy. But mostly people mention words that express difficult emotions, difficult feelings. And then, and this is the most critical question maybe, I ask, okay, you remember something from when you were a kid, you still remember it decades later. You still remember that there's emotion attached to it. And now my question is, at the time, did you talk to anybody about it? Did you have a conversation with a friend or a parent or a caring teacher, a concerned adult? Most people, not everyone, but most people will raise their hands and say, no, I didn't. There will always be some people who did have those conversations, but in almost every audience, it doesn't matter the demographic of the audience, the age or the racial makeup or, who the audience is. Almost every audience, the majority of the people in the room did not have a conversation. And if you think about the 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds, they're pretty chatty. Right? Those 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds are inclined to just say what's on their minds. They blurt stuff out all the time. And yet so many of us can look back at this experience and remember that we did not talk about it. We didn't blurt it out. We didn't tell other people. So you have to ask the question, why not? And, maybe this is my clinical psychology background coming out, but for me, it speaks to the fact that we learned early on that there's some things we're not supposed to talk about. And this is one of them. Race-related experiences, racism, race-related issues are things that grown-ups in the environment about, that you should not mention, you shouldn't talk about it. And I know that we may talk about this a little bit later, but when we even think about the pushback against critical race theory, it's really a social don't talk about it, right? That there's so many cues in the environment that teach us from an early age, this is a toxic subject. People don't want to hear about it. And so fast forward to, being a student at the University of Michigan or someplace else. Now you're in a classroom where a faculty member says, we're going to read, we're going to talk about, we're going to discuss issues related to racism. Deep in your gut, you may be having a feeling like, I'm not supposed to do this. This is not what's supposed to happen. That knot in the stomach, the sweaty palms people get, the kind of tongue-tiedness that happens, all of that, I think, goes back to our early socialization that doesn't happen just when we're kids, but gets reinforced. So fast forward to your question, why, what have people been talking about over this last 18 months? What have people been asking me about? In essence, it's how do I have this conversation? How do I get past my anxiety and the anxiety of other people to really move this conversation forward in a way that will be productive, that will allow us to make change? Because at the end of the day, we can't solve a problem we can't talk about.
Thank you. I was going to ask you, and you started to address how you juxtaposed kind of what you just described around the normative race experiences that are starting in early childhood with the push against engaging race in any kind of critical space within our K through 12 schools, as if we didn't engage it, that children would not actually be having experiences.
Right.
Showing that they are, and why not have a developmental space that could support them?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's another thing I just want to take this moment to say, another place where I see a lot of continuity from what was going on. Again, more people asking the question today than maybe 20 years ago, but there's been a lot of use of language, right? Today, you can read How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. We hear the term anti-racist a lot. And people are asking, what is that? What is it? What does it mean to be anti-racist? I don't know, And for me, that often comes back to not really understanding, many people not really understanding what racism is. You know, many people think of racism as individual acts of meanness, you know, calling somebody a name, refusing to rent an apartment, you know, one individual refusing to rent to a person of color, that kind of thing. Or burning you know, writing racist graffiti, or, you know, burning a cross on somebody's lawn. Those individual acts of racial bigotry is what many people think of as, quote, racist. And if you say something is racist, then they think you're saying I'm that kind of a person who does those kinds of horrible things. But in fact, we know as social scientists that racism is more than just individual attitudes or behaviors. It is, in fact, a whole system of policies and practices that reinforce a system of advantage based on racial categories. We know that race as a category is an artificial construct, right? You know, there's only really one category, which is human, right? But we have these artificial categories that we have created over time and that have meaning in our world in terms of how people are viewed, how they're treated, et cetera. But if you don't have a full understanding of racism, you can't really understand what anti-racism is. And so often I find that many of the conversations I'm asked to participate in have everything to do with defining terms and helping people wrap their brains around what is the essence of the problem we're trying to address.
Thank you. I think both of your kind of comments around you know, the early experiences of racism and this kind of notion of different views or understandings of anti-racism, you know, kind of hit the root of some of the social and cultural polarization in our society right now. And you know, speaking in the context of higher ed, like even though higher education institutions are sometimes characterized as ideologically homogenous bastions of liberalism, there are actually lots of perspectives on issues related to race and comfort levels in engaging in race. And when I say higher education, I mean our students, our faculty, our staff, you know, people whose lived and daily experiences are in this space and who shape the cultures of this space. You know, harkening back to the intergroup dialogues conference that we connected with you around a year years ago, I'd love to hear your thoughts about effectively engaging across these differences that have both roots in the social fear that socialize, as well as in different understandings of the concept and the history.
Yeah, well, let me start with history, if I might. You know, one of the things, I can't remember who it was who asked me this question, but some time ago, somebody asked a question about, you know, if you could wave a magic wand and change something in this education system, ecosystem in which we operate, what would it be? And I think what I said then and what I think today is I would dramatically increase the knowledge of US history in the context of US racism, right? You know, global history, world history would probably be good too, but in the context of the US, I'm struck by how little historical knowledge many people have. When I was teaching a course on the psychology of racism, I often found that my students, you know, who come through high school and moving through college had very little historical knowledge about racism in the United States. You know, they of course knew that slavery had once existed. They knew something about, you know, the Montgomery bus boycott and Rosa Parks, but there was so much information about the ways in which racism had shaped their own educational experience, the way in which racism shaped the neighborhoods in which they lived in terms of housing discrimination, redlining, residential segregation, the ways in which racism impacted employment patterns in the United States, not just today, but over decades. And so that lack of information contributes to the polarization, I think, that we experience. Because without information, people have opinions. There's no shortage of opinions. And even today, I mean, what we know, what we see around the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, is that even when we think we're talking about facts, masks help prevent the spread of germs, for example, that is disputed by others who will say, maybe not, right? So we know that even when it seems like an indisputable fact, people are disagreeing with one another, often along political or other ideological lines. But I say this to say, I think that a deeper knowledge of our history would benefit us all. It is often said that, those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. I'd like to say those who don't know their history don't recognize it when it's repeating. And I think we're living at a time when history is repeating itself. And that if we recognize that, we are better prepared to respond to it in effective ways. So when we think about education, higher ed, one of the things I think we could certainly do is try to increase that historical knowledge in ways that level the playing field in terms of our ability to have conversation with one another. If someone wants to have a conversation, but they're just dealing with their own lived experience and they don't have knowledge of anybody else's, or the social context, the fabric that has created that experience, it's going to be very hard to have a conversation without disrupting some assumptions. People don't like to have their assumptions disrupted. But when you get new information, you're able to think more clearly about, or see in a new way, and I would say more clearly, the problem we're talking about.
Thank you. This relates to a question that I would be curious about your perspectives on, related to, again, this past year and a half and the heightened and new awareness, so which relates to, so, I mean, I'm very struck by the idea of history, because I often wonder, like, if people are really thinking about racism and the new awareness of it as a contemporary phenomenon, like their attributions around like the statuses and the positions and the kind of how different groups are faring would be quite different than if you did have that history.
Yes.
But there are lots of people who, in the last year and a half, there was an awareness raising among, many in our society who had not either had to or to think about these issues before. And then, an eagerness to become allies, which can be, a fraught space too. So we know that allies are necessary and needed, but there can be challenges in being effective in an ally space. And I say this, not only talking about the terrific work that's been done in the student learning space around allyship, but also how we grapple with our other roles in our institutions, as faculty, staff, community members. So what are some of your suggestions for those who want to be allies in the work right now, promising approaches? And then I wanted to shift to the kind of the other part of that too, is that, in this new awareness, people of color are sometimes, asked to share their experiences in ways that can, put them in the position of only being the educators.
Yes. Yeah.
Re-traumatizing in some cases, but also, supporting a more voyeuristic kind of approach. How can people of color who are trying to engage and navigate this really thorny space also be educated, nourished, and supported as we work in intergroup spaces to eradicate racism?
Yeah. Well, let me start by saying that I think it's really, so the first thing, when people say, how can I be a better ally? One of the things I often say is educate yourself, right? And if you educate yourself, if you are taking responsibility for educating yourself, that might mean you're reading things you didn't read before, or maybe you're watching videos or TED Talks you haven't seen before, but you are taking some responsibility for that learning that does not necessarily burden the people of color around you or the targeted group, because when we talk about allies, I, as a heterosexual cisgendered woman, can be an ally to someone who identifies as LGBTQ or from that community. But in order for me to be a better ally, I need to educate myself to learn something about that experience. And that learning could happen from reading, from watching videos, from doing various things that expand my knowledge and understanding, and that doesn't necessarily burden, my LGBTQ friend and asking that person to explain things to me all the time. I'm using that analogously to say, the white person who wants to better understand the experiences of people of color could ask people of color, tell me about X, or, how can I understand Y, or I have this question, or, and there are, of course, people who are sometimes willing to respond to those questions, but it can be exhausting, as you were alluding to, in terms of the self-care that the people of color themselves who are targets need. And so, so I think taking some responsibility for self-education is really important. It's like step one. And then as you are doing that, I think step two is educating others in your sphere of influence. I read this book. It really was eye-opening for me. Let me share it with you. Let's talk about it. You and me, who are of the same identity group, right? So, one white friend talking to another white friend, I didn't know about this, but then I found this out, let me share with this. Let's learn about this together. Because when the allies take responsibility for engaging other people, again, that takes some of the burden off of the targeted group. That said, I am remembering, you may remember this controversy, Tabby, about this. This was a controversy at the University of Maryland. There was a group for white allies that was launched, right, at the University of Maryland. It was launched by the Campus Counseling Center, and they put up flyers saying, whites only, basically. This is like a white allies group for whites only. And they got a lot of flack for it, right? Even students of color were like, how can you have a group talking about racism without people of color in it, right? What sense does that make? But of course, what they were intending to do was to create a space for white students who were new to the conversation to be able to practice, right? To learn some things, to practice talking about it, to get better at it without having to be the kind of voyeuristic person in the room who's just, watching while somebody else is talking about their painful experiences with racism. It was well-intentioned, and I believe they renamed their group, but continued to pursue it. But I use it as an example to say, sometimes people get, even people of color can get a little nervous or suspicious. What do you mean white people are just going to talk to each other about racism? We need to be at that table too. It's not either or. And one of the things that I often lift up as a best in class example is, of course, the work at the University of Michigan, where there is both intergroup dialogue, but also opportunities for intra-group dialogue, because both are necessary. You want the opportunity for cross-group dialogue. There's a lot of learning that happens there, but you also need those spaces where folks who are targeted by the ism, in this case racism, can refuel, recharge, get support, not have to always explain themselves, and where the allies can practice ally behavior, can talk about it, can problem solve, get support around that learning without necessarily always needing to lean on the people of color for that guidance. It's not either or, it's really both and.
It's going to connect back to your discussion about the different views of what anti-racism is and what does it mean to be an anti-racist institution.
Yes.
As a scholar and a higher education leader, you may have also seen some of the pushback against the concept of diversity or diversity, equity, and inclusion, kind of premised on the idea, well, one, that all three of those terms need to be kind of elaborated. Diversity in itself is not a solution. If it doesn't, if it's not accompanied by equity and inclusion. And then more recently, certainly I will say, as someone who, leads a center with diversity in the title, have seen some of the discussion and pushback based on the idea that anti-racism is not necessarily embedded in a diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda, that, people are pushing for anti-racism efforts instead of DEI and the like too. And I guess I wonder about your perspective, and guidance to institutions as they're, who have been engaged in diversity, equity, and inclusion work and frameworks, how they should be thinking about the connections and the integration of anti-racism and DE&I.
Well, the challenge here, of course, is that, racism is not the only ism. We know that. And so when we think about creating a campus community that is truly welcoming to everyone, then we have to think about several isms, right? We have to think about heterosexism. We have to think about classism. We have to think about sexism. We have to think about anti-Semitism. We have to think about ableism for sure. They're in addition to racism, we have to think about the needs of folks who are not, for whom English is not their first language. I mean, there are lots of ways in which people can feel excluded. Even as I say that, I think it is important to also acknowledge that there is a long history of racial exclusion that can be lifted up. It's not, to the exclusion of other things, as in we're not going to think about those other things, but it is possible to say we are going to focus on this because this is the area where we really struggle. It is generally the case that if you want to change behavior, you don't try to change everything at once, right? Just systems change, behavior change, you pick something that you're going to focus on. And in this moment, in this historic moment in our nation's history, for an organization to say, we are going to focus on anti-racism, or to get even more specific, we're going to focus on anti-Black racism. Because that is where our institution has been most troubled, one could argue. And if in fact that is the point of view, but then the question is, well, how do we know this is where we've been most troubled? Where's our data? You would need to say, let's look at our data, right? Let's look at who comes to this institution, who succeeds when they get here, who has access to opportunities in terms of all the opportunities that are available, the smorgasbord of opportunities that are available, who has true access to those things. Who are we recruiting? And by that, I mean not just students, faculty, staff, administrators. Who are we retaining? Who is able to advance through the organization? From a student point of view, advancing to graduation. From a faculty point of view, advancing to tenure and promotion. From a staff point of view, advancing to, being able to be successful in the organization and achieve promotions or whatever opportunities for movement there are within our organizations. So as we are asking those questions, I'm thinking about a report that came out today, which wasn't about higher ed. It came out in the USA Today about K through 12 education, about, who is being disciplined by school resource officers and who's being, arrested at school. How are those disciplinary practices determined by race? The reports revealed, perhaps not surprisingly, that more Black kids were being disciplined by school resource officers than other kids in schools. That's quite consistent with other data that we've seen before. But all of this is to say, how do we know how things are going? We have to ask the questions. We have to look and see who's being included, who's being left out, who's receiving benefits, who's receiving punishments, and how does that look, and what can we do about it? Who's included in the curriculum, who's missing, all of that. All of these are questions we have to ask. And if we are asking them, then we will know where our hot spots are, where our pain points are, because the data will speak for itself.
Thank you. Your response there really leads to another question related to that I'm situating within higher education around leadership. I mean, given the focus of this lecture and the namesake, your colleague and fellow higher education higher education colleague, Dr. Nancy Cantor. My question really relates to how institutions might better respond to the longtime advocacy of faculty, staff, and students of color and their allies to really address systemic racism by really grappling with the history of racism in the institution and its historical and contemporary impacts. And so I guess I heard in your response to the last question, data and like an approach to looking at like how racism has impacted critical areas of outcome, representation, and function. And I want to hear a little bit more of your thinking about that. What are your suggestions for how institutions might acknowledge, an imperfect history and present, approaches to grappling, systematic approaches for grappling with that history, and are there promising examples, that you would want to spotlight?
Yeah, well, when you ask for examples, one of the first examples I thought of, which is a very dramatic one, perhaps, is the example of Georgetown University. And so Georgetown is the oldest Catholic institution in the university in the United States. And what we learned several years ago about its history is that at a critical moment in the 1800s, when the institution was in need of funds, on the verge of closing, the priests who were running the institution bailed themselves out by selling the enslaved people who were part of their institution, right? The institution owned slaves, owned enslaved people, and they sold, I think, 237 of them in order to raise money to support the institution at a critical moment in its history. That money, the funds that were generated, led to the well-being of the institution, but clearly did not lead to the well-being of the folks who got sold literally down the river, down into the deep South, where they no doubt became part of the cotton industry and led a much different experience than they were having on the campus of Georgetown. But having said that, when that information became public knowledge, and it became public knowledge as the result of student research, right? There was students doing research on the campus who uncovered this information. When it became public, the institution had to grapple with, well, what does this mean for us today? What benefits are we experiencing today as a consequence of that ownership of people and the sale of those people? And what debt do we owe to the descendants of the people who were impacted by this decision? And that was a process that the university engaged in. There was a committee, as you know, institutions do. They created a committee that included historians and students, faculty and students and staff, and if I'm not mistaken, maybe some alums. And then there was a report, and then there was a decision made about how would this history be acknowledged today. I don't know that this was a perfect set of solutions. One of the things that was done was a statue was erected to acknowledge the contribution of those folks, right? In honor of one or more of those enslaved people, there was a statue erected on the campus and some renaming of buildings. But then there was also a commitment to scholarships, right? Scholarships available for descendants of those enslaved folks who in fact can be traced, right? So that it can be identified who those descendants were, and creating scholarships for those folks. And to my knowledge, there's still some discussion about what else should be done to remedy that wrong generations later. Now that's a very dramatic example, but one could think about other examples. One could think about institutions looking at curricular choices that were made and how they were made and what is included and what has been historically left out, and what could we do about that. One could think about housing arrangements and what housing represents on a campus, thinking about where people live and whose housing feels marginalized and who's included, and even how financial aid is awarded. I was a dean at Mount Holyoke College for a long time. I was a faculty member there, and then I became a dean. And there was a standard practice then that existed on a number of campuses, which was that students who were experiencing financial aid would have work-study jobs. And one of those work-study jobs was to essentially serve as wait staff in the dining hall. And while there's nothing wrong with having a work-study job if you are on financial aid, it's a common practice. Is there something implied in status relationships, hierarchical relationships, when the work-study students are being asked to serve students who are not on financial aid? What's the implication of that, and how does that sit in terms of recreating certain hierarchical relationships, particularly if there are racial categories associated with those categories, those groups. So, these are questions that institutions might come to different answers about, but asking the questions, having the conversation, I think is really important.
Yes, and thinking about systemic structures or kind of leadership structures that are accountable for like both analyzing and acting on that kind of information. Any change that's happening now, I'm going to want to reiterate, is likely has a deep history of activism that has led to the current change. So there's a current urgency, but it was undergirded by like long time advocacy among many communities of students, along with staff and faculty supports and allies.
Yes.
But from a leadership kind of perspective, in terms of the things that you might recommend or kind of have thoughts about, some institutions start by hiring a chief diversity officer, which for many institutions that's the starting place.
Yes.
But my thinking is that, and based on experiences, is that while faculty, staff, and students may be advocating for that type of role and position, most of the time they're not asking for one position. They're advocating structures that support meaningful change and accountability to systemic problems. in the institution and across the institution at all of these different levels that you're talking about, like from
Yes.
everything, where are people represented in the curriculum and where they're not, to student financial aid and the kinds of unintentional kinds of consequences that, that can occur depending on the kind of the ways that's implemented. On the other hand, without a dedicated person and office supporting vision and strategy and really thinking about metrics of accountability, kind of, and for pushing for moving the needle forward, systemic change is unlikely to happen, or it would have already happened. I'd love to hear your thoughts about how you think institutions and units within them can and should organize to address systemic racism on campuses. We're seeing more and more now, like in addition to a campus-wide chief diversity officer, individual units, so colleges within institutions are designating diversity officers, or leads. Our institution certainly has gone in that direction, creating some greater capacity around leadership in this space.
Yes.
But in some cases, people think, like, even within those units, if we hire that one person, they're going to come in and do the diversity. And, what is your thinking about the systems that need to be in place to allow for that kind of analysis that you just described of all the different ways and all the different levels that inequity can occur and be embedded, directly or indirectly?
Yeah, I think part of the challenge in higher education is that often, particularly like at a place like Michigan, so large, but even smaller institutions can be quite decentralized, right? So having a chief diversity officer, especially if that person is closely aligned, maybe reporting directly to the president or the provost, someone who has clear, typically chief diversity officers have a lot of responsibility, but not a lot of authority. By that, I mean, usually they don't have very many people reporting to them, right? So they have to lead through influence. They have to influence chairs of departments. They have to influence, dean. They have to influence faculty members, but they don't have direct authority over those people, so it's not like they can say, you must do this or you must do that. They have to lead through persuasion, except to the extent that they have, a senior leader, often with budgetary influence, able to help in that way, right? So if the president says, this is really important to me, my chief diversity officer is helping to lead this initiative, I've allocated resources to that person or through my office to make these things happen, that helps. Sometimes what you see is a lot of rhetoric, no resource. And that is a prescription for frustration, because, people will say, please do X, recruit more, do this, do that, change your curriculum. But if you don't have resources to help that happen, then people understandably feel like it's just talk. It's not really serious, because, we measure what matters. We also fund what matters. And so there's that. But I do think that some of the most effective change that I have seen happen on campuses is often led at the departmental level. And where our department says, we're going to do something, we're going to revise our curriculum. We are going to actively recruit our graduate students. We're going to, go to HBCUs. We're going to make the case for new faculty. We're going to do this thing at the departmental level. And when you have a department that is really doing a good job there, what happens is other departments start to say, how did you do that? Right? How did you recruit that star faculty person that nobody else seemed to be able to identify? How did you find those great students when, we don't seem to be able to recruit them? How did you get your faculty to reevaluate and redo the curriculum in ways that were more inclusive, even though there was resistance often to, those kinds of changes? So I think that, you know, having been a college president, one of the things you learn quickly is that you can't just tell people what to do, right? You can inspire them, hopefully. You can offer carrots. Sometimes you can, you know, provide a few sticks. But the idea is, if there's a vision, you know, if we have a vision of where we want to be as an institution, as a community, and if we can articulate that vision, then hopefully we can get people to start, you know, I use the analogy of a choir sometimes. You know, it's like when the choir sings well, other people want to join the choir. And so if I'm singing a song that is appealing to you and you start singing with me and we sound good, then other people are going to want to sing too. You know, now there will always be people who say, you know, I never liked that song and I have no intention of singing along with you. But if you have enough people singing, the folks who don't want to sing have less impact, right? They have less impact. And over time, they might come to see that the people who are singing are having more fun. And maybe, just maybe, I might want to sing along too. So there is, so I think it's a combination of creating a shared vision for what could be, and that new thing is better than the old thing. And we are living in a time where I think this is really important, because there are a lot of people, I mean, I think right in this moment in 2021, there are people who are holding on to an old vision that is not going to serve them well. And there's a new vision emerging, and the tension we feel collectively, the polarization we feel, is about the tension between an old vision and a new vision. There's a book I read not long ago called The Sum of Us, by The Sum as in S-U-M, The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. And the opening chapter in the book, or maybe it's the introduction, starts with the question, why can't we have nice things? You know, like, why can't we have nice things in America? You know, that, and the answer to her question is because our racism gets in our way. You know, why can't we have universal health care? Because there's an old narrative that you don't want to give stuff to people who don't deserve it. And those people who quote, don't deserve it are typically, in the mind of those who have this point of view, Black and brown people. Over my dead body, am I going to use my tax dollars to support those fill in the blank people? Well, that works against everyone. There's a chapter in her book that says, racism ruined the swimming pool. That's the title of the book, Racism Ruined the Swimming Pool. And what is it about? It's about white people who didn't want Black children swimming in the public pool back in the days of Jim Crow. And rather than allow them to swim in the pool when that kind of discrimination became illegal, they decided to fill in the pool, fill it out with dirt, turn it into an empty grass lawn or something. And now nobody gets to swim. Ergo her question, why can't we have nice things? Why can't we have public pools in our community? Well, because some people don't want other people to swim in them. If we could get past that kind of irrational thinking, we could have a more functional society. But that requires addressing the elephant in the room, which is systemic racism. Which brings us in some ways back to where we started. You know, if we can't talk about that elephant, there's a big stinky elephant in this room. If we can't talk about it, we are going to find ourselves smelling to high heaven, but with an elephant that continues to take up too much space in our collective imagination.
Yeah, it brings us back to the, you know, we can't talk about it, and the history that McGee piece work, also the ruining of the swimming pool for everyone also makes me think about some of the work that I was doing in graduate school. I was asked to work on a project in the Charlottesville school system, Charlottesville, Virginia, to address the problem of unengaged Black parents. And come to find out that Charlottesville has a significant and stable Black community where the children grew up in or are remaining in the space. And in the early 70s, the schools closed rather than desegregate.
Yes, for
So-
5 years. Yes.
Well, people would rather have uneducated children than to have, integrated schools. And then the question then became not a mystery to me because those children were now the parents of the
Yes.
children. So the unengaged, which were really more distrustful parents, they weren't unengaged because they were quite engaged outside of the school building.
Right.
But the perception of them was that they were unengaged because they weren't showing engagement like white parents. But knowing the history and the context and the reticence to actually face that history helped us really understand and to connect with the school and with the families involved in that project in a different way. So I think you're coming back to where we started about the fear of discussing race, but also the lack of connection to the history that shapes the way that we approach race. It's a cycle.
Yes, yeah. At the end of my book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race, in the 2017 edition, the last chapter is called Signs of Hope, Sites of Progress. And I put in that chapter because I really wanted it to be, we live at a time when there's, I think, a lot of pessimism, and I wanted to inspire or engender hope. I wanted to end on a hopeful note because change, and I do deeply believe that change is possible. I don't think change is always easy, but it is certainly possible. And so I was very interested in looking for examples of places where hope was evident. I'm happy to say Michigan was one of those places in the sense that I visited with, when I came in 2016 and I was working on my book, I spent some time with students who had been involved in intergroup dialogue. And one of the things I heard, this is not going to sound hopeful at first, I'm going to just tell the story, but one of the students I talked to was a young African-American woman who was a first-year student. And she was living in the residential community that has dialogue as part of its practice. And, it was a community residential program where the students were engaging in, is an intentionally diverse community, and the students were doing intergroup dialogue as part of their living experience. And in this situation, she was telling me about, in the fall of 2016, the difficulty of having posters, white supremacist posters on the campus, and how upsetting it was for her to see these posters. And I know that, it wasn't clear who was putting them up, but they were, appearing around Ann Arbor and around the campus. And she talked about how distracting it was for her, to be sitting in class. She was taking, I think, a geology class or something like that, a science class. I think it was geology, where they were learning about rocks of different kinds. And she said, how hard it was for her to focus on learning the different kinds of these rocks because all she could think about were these posters, and not knowing who had put up the posters. One of few young Black women in the class, she would sort of look around and wonder, like, was somebody in her class one of the people who was putting up posters? It was just, this was what was on her mind when she's supposed to be thinking about her geology. And it was just really hard. And then she said, but thankfully, she was grateful for the opportunity to be in this community where she could talk about that, where she could sit with her peers, some of whom were of color, but some of whom were white, and feel some support around that from this residential community where they were able to talk together about these issues of race. And so for me, it was a great example of both the challenge, right? The challenge of being a young Black woman and having to deal with that hostile environment being created by those posters, but also the benefit of a community that allows for conversation, because it's in that sharing of experience that she felt supported. And it was, as she said to me in the conversation we had, the difference between, being able to sustain herself in this environment and not being able to. And I think that when institutions provide those opportunities, even when the conversations are hard, it makes a difference.
Thank you. I'm gonna, one more question, and then there's a cluster of audience questions as well that touch upon some of the themes we've been talking about. I guess I want to, do you have any additional thoughts around, I mean, that example makes me think about some of the efforts to really name and support students, to name the issue of racism and to support students who are returning to campus here and nationally, given that the continued experience of racism and trauma related to COVID and related to kind of the quote unquote racial reckoning. Support spaces as people enter or re-enter spaces where they're minoritized is one message that I heard from you. In our work within CID, we recently partnered with some national partners to focus on evidence-based approaches for thinking about supporting students return to campus, particularly students of color. Do you have additional thoughts about that kind of support as many institutions, including ours, are starting their fall terms with a return to campus approach?
I do think being able to name it and talk about it and create spaces. Not everyone wants to have those conversations, but being able to create those spaces is really useful. And I'm going to come back to the example of this young woman I spoke about, because one of the things that she said to me was that, when these things were happening on campus, she had some professors who mentioned it in class, who said, I know this is a hard time. These things are happening. This is difficult. This is, and that happened in classes where it wasn't necessarily the subject of the course, right? But where a professor just acknowledged that this is going on. It makes it hard. I just want to acknowledge this is hard. Not necessarily spending a lot of time talking about it, but just sort of naming and acknowledging. And then she talked about being in class where there was no acknowledgement. And she felt much better in those classes where it was acknowledged. And so I think it just this is just one person's example, but I think it does, generally speaking, make sense to not to pretend it's, to name that elephant, not to pretend it's not here, right? Because it's kind of a gaslighting experience. If you are having, if you're having to deal with issues of this kind and nobody's talking about it, that feels like, it just feels it's very isolating. It's very isolating. It's very stressful. It's very, disheartening in many ways. And so I know from talking to faculty and faculty development sessions that many times faculty are reluctant, and staff perhaps too, reluctant to engage in these conversations because they don't know how to do it. They're afraid they'll make things worse, or they'll, find themselves in an awkward position, or at a time when, people are so quick to post you on Twitter, if you make a mistake, you'll be put on blast. And then what does that mean? But I also know that Michigan is a place with a great Center for Teaching and Learning, where there are opportunities to test these things out and get support. And ultimately, I think it benefits all of us when we build our skill set in that way.
Thank you. There are a couple of clusters of questions I think that our facilitator colleagues have grouped for us.
Okay.
One set of questions relates back to your comment about critical race theory being a collective shh.
Yes.
And the question poser says, but isn't a university a place where students should be taught how to think and not what to think? Wouldn't it be conducive to expose students to critical race theory as well as arguments? One was that there are actually other critical theories related to race. This is not the theory, and there are also perspectives that might, align with or not align with it, and to expose students to it and encourage critical thinking, dialogue, and respectful debate.
Yeah, let me clarify, because I want to be sure that I was not misunderstood. I was not saying that critical race theory is a collective shh. I was saying that the pushback against critical race theory, that the people who are trying to prevent critical race theory from being taught
Yes.
are essentially trying to hush us about racism. I absolutely agree that the university is a place where you should learn to think, and not what to think, but how to think. And I also think it's important to understand that I actually don't like the phrase critical race theory as a label. I don't think I don't think it's really accurate. From my understanding of what we call critical race theory is that it's an analytical tool. It's an approach. It's an analytic approach. What is often called critical race theory is not like it's, a theory like the theory of evolution, right? It's an analytic approach to thinking about how race and racism work in our society, and how it grew out of, for those who may not know, critical race theory grew out of legal studies, legal scholars wanting to look at how critical ideas about race were embedded in the law. And so to the extent that we think about how race and racism has been embedded in educational systems, we might say we're applying critical race theory to education. Or if we're thinking about how race and racism has been embedded in public policy around housing, we might say we are applying critical race theory to that subject matter. So it's kind of an analytic tool, thinking about how is racism, or how is racism embedded in the history of the United States. Now, some people say racism is not embedded in the history of the United States. That's an anti-American statement to make. But I'm so sorry, I would have to say, help me understand how it is not. We can have a conversation about that. But when you hear people critique critical race theory, and by people I mean pundits on television, parents who say, I don't want it in my kid's school. The reality is it's not in your kid's school, but but when you hear the common person, the average TV watcher saying, it sounds like a bad idea to me, what they are often saying is talking about race causes discomfort. Sometimes it does, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't have those conversations. You will hear people say that, talking about racism or talking about race in school causes racism, causes kids to think in racial categories, and when otherwise they would, quote, be colorblind. But you and I know as psychologists, they are not colorblind. That kids notice difference, children notice difference, and respond to the differences they notice as early as 6 months old. That doesn't mean they're racist at 6 months, but that they notice difference, and as they get older, they start to learn the social value that's attached to the differences that they notice. And so you can hear 3-year-olds saying to each other, you can't be the superhero because superheroes aren't brown. If maybe they haven't seen Black Panther, but that kind of a statement from a 3-year-old is a function of having absorbed stereotypes, messages from the wider culture. And kids are absorbing that all the time. So if we say we can't talk about the ways in which the popular culture reinforces ideas of normative ideas, racial hierarchies that have been deeply embedded in our society, that says to me, you're trying to shh the conversation about racism. So I want to be clear. I wasn't saying critical race theory is a shush.
No, and the
Yeah.
question askers were definitely framing it as the pushback means should too.
Yes,
So
the pushback.
not the question writers.
Yes, but definitely, I taught a course on the psychology of racism for 20 years before I became an administrator. And in that class, my students often disagreed with the things they read. They wrote articles, essays. I asked them, here's an argument, do you think it makes sense or not? Write about it. I think critical thinking is at the core of effective education.
Before we wrap, I guess, are there any, so there are some questions related to diversity and equity and inclusion leaders. So going back to your comment about these roles being roles of influence
Yes.
or largely being roles of influence in many cases. What advice or nuggets would you give to new diversity, equity, and inclusion leaders? And I guess I will expand that to be formal or informal, but the question writers were asking about, we're new in these roles, and what nuggets of wisdom would you share for people who are new in these roles, who are trying to exert this influence?
I would start by saying that if you're new in the role, before you accept the role, find out who you're going to report to and what your budget is. I would start with that, because, as I said, often I always worry, for example, when I'm in an organization or visiting an organization, and I visit a lot of college campuses where the person who's in that role is young and doesn't, which is not to say you can't be effective, but sometimes you see people who have been hired, they're relatively junior in the organization. And so it's hard to influence when you have junior status, right? It's hard to influence. And if you are not reporting to a person of a significant authority, you don't have the institutional gravitas you need. So the first thing I would say to somebody who's new in a role, before you take the role, think about what your sphere of influence is going to be and where's your institutional support coming from. I think that's just structurally an important question to ask. But I do think that identifying who your allies are in the organization, who are the people who were doing the work before you arrived? We know that there are people who have a long history at places like the University of Michigan and elsewhere, who've been, laboring in the vineyard for a long time, and who know where the bodies are buried, so to speak. Who know where the fights have been, where the people, they're often people who are well-intentioned but need strategies, right? Sometimes people want to do the right thing, but they don't know what the right thing is to do. And so when you can find those people, you can help them be more effective by providing effective strategies. Then there are people who may know what the right thing is, but don't want to do it. That's a different population. But you want to start with the willing, right? So you need to find who are the willing and how can you galvanize their support and help them be more effective. I'm going to come back to my choir analogy. We often say some people may be listening to this conversation and they may be saying, you know, the people who really needed to hear it didn't tune in. You're preaching to the choir. I like to say the choir needs rehearsal. If we can identify who the choir is and help them sing better, it inspires others. The choir gets bigger. But start with the choir. Don't, you know, start with the folks who don't like to sing. Start with the choir and help them sing better. And then you have the ripple effect of that improved performance across the institution.
You. Okay, I'll be drawing on that choir analogy, lots and lots of going forward. With that, I think it's that time, getting the cue that we'll need to wrap up. I'll close by thanking all of the attendees today for taking their time to join us today, and also by thanking you again, Beverly, for joining us and for continuing. Michigan will never let you go, of course. But thank you. As Rob mentioned when in his opening today, there's really no one and no voice more suited for the Cantor Lecture and the Cantor Lecture this year and in this current social context than you. So thank you for sharing your knowledge, your thoughts, and your wisdom to support our community as we all work in our individual and collective efforts. So thank you.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much. You've been a great conversation partner, Tabby. I really appreciate this opportunity. So thank you very much.
And to everyone who attended and is about to log off, I hope you all would come away feeling affirmed that you're not in it alone. There are other people who are in it trying to work on these things and that see you and what you're trying to do, that you learn something, maybe stimulated to think about an issue in a different way than you did when you were coming in, or you got some ideas about how to think about and approach a topic, and that we all come away. I hope I certainly do, and I hope it's shared by others, feeling inspired or newly invigorated to do the tough work of facing and dismantling systemic racism. So thank you everyone again, and have a wonderful day.